Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Ches. We're 5 lines down. Utzricha. We have a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in 2 different cases, and both revolve around the issue of kinyan peros. Do we classify and define kinyan peros as a kinyan haguf or not? And we have an afkamina in first and foremost the case of bikurim, whether or not you're chayiv in bikurim, in mikra bikurim, ha'adam asher nasato li, can you recite asher nasato li if all you have is rights to peros, meaning Ruvain sold Shimon a karka in order that Shimon can eat the peros? Can Shimon be makri the mikra bikurim asher nasato li if he only has a kinyan peros? And a second case in which a person sells a field during the Yovel, and when Yovel is knowing, and therefore when Yovel comes around, the karka goes back to its original owner, and therefore the buyer, the purchaser, only has rights to eat the peros. And once again, we're going to have a machlokas in that case between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which revolves around the very same issue. Utzricha, we need both of them. If we only had the machlokas in a case where a person purchases a field and he only has rights to eat the peros, and now the issue is whether or not he can be korei mikra bikurim bahi. In that case, kama Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says that he cannot recite the reading of ha'adam asher nasato li because kinyan peros lav ki kinyan haguf tefi kanachis adaiti the pera kanachis. The original deal was only a deal on peros. So when the lokeach purchases peros, he doesn't have anything in the gufa karka. The gufa karka remains in the possession of the ownership of the mocher. And he never had intention, this lokeach, to acquire ownership on the karka. Aval bahach, but in the case where a person buys a piece of karka and the yovel is noeg, adaiti the gufa kanachis, he purchased the entire karka, both the guf and the peros. And therefore Reish Lakish would concede in that case that he's chayiv in bikurim and mikra bikurim, and it's his karka because he bought the karka and the gufa karka, and it's all his. So there's a difference now, according to the Gemara, between a person who buys karka for the purpose of peros as opposed to a person who buys karka at the time that yovel is noeg. When a person buys a piece of karka for peros, he has no schus, no ownership at all in the karka. And for example, he's not allowed to be chofer bioris sikanamoris in the karka. But if a person buys karka bisman shayovel noeg, then certainly he acquires ownership in the essence of the land that he purchased for that period of time until the yovel, and he's permitted to dig ditches and holes in the karka because he owns the gufa karka. So therefore, we need a special chiddush in the case of kona karka b'zman shaynoeg yovel noeg, that even in that case, Reish Lakish insists that all he has is a kinyan peros lavki kinyan agufta. Now the Gemara goes and flips it the other way around. And supposing we only had the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the case of a person who buys karka when the yovel is noeg, b'hakam Rabbi Yochanan. Here's where Rabbi Yochanan would say that he has a kinyan aguf, and therefore the konet during the yovel time is going to read the Parsha Bikurim because his das when he purchased the karka was to purchase the karka itself up till the Shnasa Yovel Bahach. But in a case of a person who bought a field only for peros, I might have thought Module Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan would concede to Reish Lakish that kinyan aguf, kinyan peros lavki kinyan aguf, and therefore he cannot read the parsha of Adam asher nasato li. Tzricha, and therefore I need Rabbi Yochanan to tell me that even in this scenario, even in a case where he buys a field simply for the peros, he has no other rights to the field, nevertheless, he makes a kinyan of the gufa karka leperos seha. And Rabbi Yochanan had to explicate that he can read mikra bikurim because kinyan ha-peros ki kinyan ha-gufta. Hashma. The Gemara wants to prove that Kinyan Peros is Kinyan Aguftami by virtue of a Mishnah in Bikurim in the first parak of Bikurim, and that would support Rabbi Yochanan's view. Hakone Ilan V'Karka'o. If a person purchases a tree and the karka that surrounds the tree, so now he owns only one particular tree, maybe when this tree that he purchased produces fruit, he will take that fruit to the Beis HaMikdash. That's called Havah, and he's Chayav Bikurim. But the question now is, can he read and recite the Parsha Bikurim? V'Koreh. He's allowed to read the Parsha of Mikra Bikurim, Adom Asher Nasato Li. Now, even though this karka will ultimately return to the mocher, to the seller at Yovel, which means that the buyer only has rights to the peros, nevertheless, the Mishnah in Bikurim, supporting that view of Rabbi Yochanan, the Kinyan Peros, Kinyan Aguftami, obligates him in Kriyas Mikra Bikurim. The Gemara rejects it. The Mishnah was discussing a situation where there is no Yovel. And that means that Lo Hayu Kol Yisrael Alad Mosam. In order for the Yovel to be Noeg, we need Kol Yisrael Alad Mosam. And therefore, even during the period of the Beis HaMikdash, when there was a Chiyuv Bikurim, nevertheless, there was a period of time where it wasn't Kol Yisrael Alad Mosam, and therefore there was no Yovel that was Noeg. So therefore the buyer purchased a Kinyan Aguf in addition to Kinyan Aperos. And that means that even according to Reish Lakish, since the Yovel is not Noeg, therefore it's a Kinyan Gomor, and he owns the Guf, and therefore he's Chayiv in Mikra Bikurim. Now the Gemara wants to prove the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan that Kinyan Peros Kinyan Aguf from another mission in the first parak of Bikurim, Hakonish Shnei Lamos B'toch Sadeh Shel Chavero, which means the following: a person purchases two trees, then all he has is Kinyan Peros. He has no schus in the karka itself, and therefore Mevi V'Eino Kore. Now, by the fact that the Mishnah limits this halacha to Shnei Lamos, I could be medaik from the Mishnah, Shloshi Lanos, if he purchased 3 Lanos, and he has the schus in the karka, then Mevi V'Kore. Now, wait a second. If the Yovel is Noheg, then the karka is going to revert back to its original owner, which means that the purchaser does not own the Gufa karka. All he owns is Peros. And if that be the case, how can it be Mevi V'Kore and recite Ha'adomasha Nasato Li, unless you assume that Kinyan Peros, Kinyan Aguftami, here's a proof to Rabbi Yochanan. Nami, the same answer, and the Gemara rejects it as Mansha Ein HaYovel Noeg, and the karka therefore will not go back to the Mocher. The Lokeach purchased a full-fledged Kinyan, not only in the Peros, but also in the Guf. Even Reish Lakish would agree that he's Mevi V'Kore. V'hashta di Omar of Chizda. Now the Gemara is going to reject all the proofs that we had from the two Mishnayos in a different way, an alternative way of rejecting those proofs. And we have a statement of Rav Chizda regarding the machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish for the Kinyan Peros, Kinyan Aguftami, and Rav Chizda severely limits the scope of that machlokes. It's dafka b'yovel sheni. So the first Yovel, when Klal Yisrael entered into Eretz Yisrael and onwards, then following that first Yovel, what the Bnei Yisrael were aware of and they understood is that the karka goes back to its original owner. And from that period of time, having passed the first Yovel, then Reish Lakish holds that any purchase subsequent to that first Yovel on the part of Lokeach, that's not a Kinyan Aguf. He already learned the lesson. He understands the halacha that the karka will revert back with Yovel to the original owner. Aval b'yovel rishon, but in Eretz Yisrael, the first Yovel, when people did not realize what the power of Yovel was, Divrei Hakol, maybe V'Korei, even Reish Lakish would agree that the Lokeach has acquired a full-fledged kinyan, not only of Peros, but also of Guft. At this point, when he purchased the Karka, he thought he was under the impression, and that's the Das Kona, and Das Machna fits into the Das Kona, that he's being Kona the Gufa Karka. And therefore, Reish Lakish would agree that the kinyan here is in the Gufa Karka. Now, if that be the case, we can now reject the two rayos that we brought from the two Mishnais in the first parak of Bikurim Lo Kasha, Ha b'yovel Rishon, Ha b'yovel Sheni. Don't ask me a kasha from those Mishnayos that clearly indicate that the Lokeach, since he's Mevi V'Korei, has acquired a Kinyan Aguf. That's referring to Yovel Rishon. And according to Rav Chisda, even Reish Lakish agrees that in Yovel Rishon, before they experienced the Yovel and Achzoras HaKarkos Baleim, that the Lokeach purchased Kinyan Haguf. V'had Reish Lakish, he was only talking about Yovel Sheni when the Kavanah of the Lokeach was only to buy a Kinyan Peros. Okay, now we're going to learn a little bit of a sugya in Masechta Erchin, Daf Chav Zayin. With regard to ownership of karka in Eretz Yisrael, there are two categories. There's something called a stei achuza, and there's something called a stei makna. First, we'll try to describe the difference between the two, meaning not lahalacha, but what's the mitzius. A stei achuza is a sada that was inherited ben achar ben from the original chalukas haaretz. A stei makna, on the other hand, is a sada that a person purchases from his friend. It may have been a stei achuza in the possession of Ruvain, but Shimon now purchases the sada from Ruvain, and it's called a stei makna. And a stei makna will revert back to the original mocher at the Yovel time. But what's the nafkamina between a stei achuza and a stei makna as far as we're concerned? The difference is in a case where a person purchased land, one of these two categories, and he was magdish the land that he purchased. And herein lies the difference in afkamina between a stei achuza and a stei makna. In the case of a stei achuza, if the magdish who purchased this stei achuza did not undergo a process of geula, in other words, he wasn't poda the hegdesh before Yovel, then the gizbar, since there was no pidyon of the hegdesh, has rights to sell the karka. And in such a case, the magdish who purchased the stei achuza could no longer be goel the sada. And even after Yovel, the sada does not go back to the magdish, the original lokeach, but rather it belongs to hegdesh. And it'll be divided up amongst the kohanim based on a parsha in Vayikra Chav Zayin. V'im lo yigal sasadeh v'im achar sasadeh lishacher lo yigoel od v'hoya hasadeh v'tzeiso b'yovel kodesh Hashem kistei acherim lakoin tiach uzasa. However, in a case of a stei makna, and the lokeach purchased a stei makna, and now he was magdish and he wasn't goel the sada. Now, after being magdish, the gizbar sold that sada to someone else. Now, with Yovel, the sada goes back to its original bailin, who sold it. It doesn't belong to hegdesh, and it's not divvied up amongst the kohanim. This is also derived from the parsha in Vayikra Chav Beis. So the Gemara now wants to suggest, in light of this introduction that we gave, that the machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish seems to be an old machlokas tanoim. Lema kitanoi. Shall we suggest that the machlokas of Yochanan Reish Lakish is the machlokas tanoi between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon on the one hand and Rabbi Meir on the other? The Mishnah in Masechet Erchin says the following: if a person pays his father for a sada, and now it's really a stay makna in the hands of the ben, because he didn't inherit it as a stay achuza, but rather he purchased it as a stay makna. Therefore, vikdisha, if the son went ahead and he was magdish the sada, and here we have to add a very important condition here, bechaye aviv, his father's still alive, so there was no status of stay achuza yet, but there's only a status of stay makna, v'yakach meis aviv. Now we have an interesting phenomenon, because once his father dies, then the ben will inherit the sada from his father. Minayin shetehei lefanav kistei achuza. Now that his father died and the status of the sada has changed and been transformed from that of a stay makna to a stay achuza, which means that if the ben is not goel and the gizbar sells the land, it's not going to go back to the magdish, it'll go back to the kohanim, like a stay achuza, as we discussed before. Talmud Lomar. How do we derive this from extra words in the pasuk? Vayikra Chav Zayin again. The imes stay miknasa asher lo mistei achuzaso yagdish lashem. And the words asher lo mistei achuzaso are redundant, because we're talking about a stay makna that's explicit in the pasuk, and therefore it's not a stay achuza. So why do you have to add asher lo mistei achuza if it's a say? It says it's a stay makna. But rather, it's coming to teach me that only a sada she'ena re'uya leo stay achuza. When he was magdishid, it wasn't re'uya to become a stay achuza. Yotza, to the exclusion of zu, in the case where a ben purchases a sada from his father, and at that moment in time, it's re'uya leos stay achuza, because when his father will die and he'll inherit it, it becomes a stay achuza in the hands of the son. Sheru'uya leos stay achuza, and therefore it goes out to Kohanim biyovel. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon. So what do we see? What do we derive from Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon based on their drasha from the extra words asher lo mistei achuzaso? That in the case of the ben, even though at the time that the ben purchased the field, it still is considered a stay achuza, and how much more so if his father died and then he was magdish the sada, it has a din of stay achuza. And the Gemara is going to derive from that kinyan peros lav ki kinyan aguftam. And if it's lav ki kinyan aguftami, then we understand that it could be transformed into a stay achuza. It's not really a stay mak. Where Meir disagrees with Omer, if the ben was magdish the son and the father is still alive, and the son had purchased the field from his father as a stay makna, even though now the father died, but the father had sold the field to his son, and now it goes back to Yovel with the regular dinim of Yovel, and it goes back to the original Bailim as a result of this mechira. What about the pasuk? Minayin lokeach stay sodomi aviv umeis aviv yakach ikdisha minayin shetei lefanav kistei achuza, and it doesn't go back in Yovel; it goes to the hegdesh into the divvy up in the Kohanim. Tamalom of Yimes Sadeh Sdei Miknoso Shalom Misteach Uzoso Soda She'ena Steach Uzo Yotza Zu Shehi Steach Uzo. The Ilu L'Rab Yehuda Rab Shimon, they don't have that drush of the pasuk. They have a drush for a bigger chiddush, that even if at the time of the Hagdasha the Sada was in the Rishus of the Ben as a stay makna, afterwards when the father dies, it transforms into a stay achuza, which means that it is divvied up amongst the Kohanim, and it's not choseres biyovel. Whereas Rabbi Meir's drasha, in the view of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, we don't need a pasuk. The pasuk is not addressing that case where it was already a stei achuza because his father died, and then the ben was magdashit. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that the status of that soda is that of a stei achuza. So therefore, we're going to use the pasuk for a bigger chiddush, even though he was magdashit b'chaya of. My love, the Gemara analyzed b'haka miflagi. What is the fundamental yesod of this machlok between Rabbi Meir on the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon on the other? Rabbi Meir's savar kinyan peros kinyan aguf tami. Rabbi Meir holds that even though we're talking about bisman shayovel noeg, I mean that's the entire discussion here about stei achuza, stei makna, and therefore the purchaser only has rights to peros because the gufa karka is going to be choz b'yovel. The ben, when he buys the karka from his father, he doesn't have anything more than a kinyan peros. But Rabbi Meir holds that a kinyan peros that he has even during the lifetime of his father is kinyan ad guftami. And therefore, Baha, b'misas aviv, hu delo yoris v'lo midi. If now the ben has acquired full-fledged ownership through the mechira on the gufa karka, and that's before the father died, then this ksada cannot be considered a stei achuza, because he won't inherit it from his father insofar as he owns the karka itself, begufa. It's only a stei makna. Hilkach, therefore, meis aviv v'achkach ikdisha. If his father died and then he was magdashit, we would have said that it still has the status of a stei makna, even though the hegdesh took place after his father died. Therefore, I need a pasuk to be mechadish. No, that it still has the status of a stei achuza. But Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Savri kinyan peros lav kinyan aguftami, and therefore b'chai aviv, the ben in this son only has a kinyan peros, ubaha, and therefore b'misas aviv hashta hu dekayoris. Now he's inheriting the karka from his father after his father's death, and he's now inheriting the gufa karka. Therefore, becomes a stei achuza hilkach meis aviv v'achakach ikdisha lo tzricha kra. In the case where his father died and he inherited the kinyan aguf, and it became now a stei achuza, I don't need a pasuk to tell me that it has the status of a stei achuza. It's not choser b'yovel, but rather after the hekdesh, it belongs to hekdesh to divide up into amongst the kohanim. Shari gufa sada niknalo. He already acquired the gufa sada through Yerusha, and therefore it's a stei achuza. So now I have a superfluous pasuk for this drasha. Chitz the crow. Why do I need the pasuk? According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, like disha, if he is magdashit while his father was still alive, before he inherited the karka, the akach meis aviv hu de itzrich, and now I need the pasuk. Excuse me 1 second. the key for the machsan you have?
And I labeled what's nachon.
Maybe I'll get it back from you. Could you be in touch with Abby Sick? And I see we're running out of computer paper. Maybe we could use ibuprofen. I could use okay. Sorry for that. V'chiyitzter kra lekdisha v'achach meis aviv hu deitzrich. I need a pasuk to teach me that even if the akdoshas hasada took place while the sada was still in the status of a stay makna, nevertheless, since down the line the ben will inherit this sada as a stay achuza, it has the din of a stay achuza. So machlokas b'shin Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish about whether kinyan apes kinyan guf is identical with the machlokas from Yehuda Reb Shimon and Rabbi Meir. So it's very strange then that Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish should argue about something that was an old ancient machlokas tanoim. And the Gemara answers no. Amar Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak v'olam emel l'chabi alma kasavri, even Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon hold that kinyan peros ki kinyan aguf dami. They agreed to Rabbi Meir that we need a pasuk to teach us that if the higdash of the ben of this field took place after the death of the father, it has the status of a steachuza. Why? Because kinyan peros we're holding now is kinyan aguftami. So therefore, I need a pasuk that the stay makna transforms its status into a stay achuza with the death of the father. And therefore, kra ashkachu v'dorosh. But rather, what happens here is that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon had a different pasuk, which was redundant, and they darshaned their conclusion based on a different pasuk. Why? Because lichtov rachmana, the Torah should have said, im es stay miknos asher lo achuzasa, to teach us that a stay makna, that the ben was magdish after the death of his father, has the status of a stay achuza because the father died and the son inherited his father. Why did the Torah have to add an extra piece and say asher lo mistay achuza so? So the extra word mistay is going to teach us that sadash sheina ruya leo stay achuza yot, right, is considered stay makna, but yotza to the exclusion of a sada sheruya leo stay achuza. So when the ben will inherit his father after his father's death, even if he was magdish during the lifetime of his father, and then his father died, it has the status of a stay achuza. Amar Rav Yosef, he loved Amar Rav Yochanan kinyan peres kinyan guftami lo motza yadav v'rad lo b'beis hamedrash. We're going to try to prove that Rabbi Yochanan had no choice, based on a different statement, a different position of his, than to accept the principle, adopt the principle of kinyan pereski kinyan agufta. Tiyomer of Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, we have a statement attributed to Rabbi Yochanan, ha'achim shecholku, when the father dies and the brothers divvy up the estate. Are we going to apply the principle of Brera that from the time of the death of the father and the original Yerusha, Ruvain inherited this piece, Shimon that piece? No, we're not going to say that. But rather, Ein Brera, and therefore, Lekuchos Hein. When they divvy up the land, the real estate the estate that was inherited, it's as if each person, each son, now acquires ownership on his parcel of land as a tmura, so to speak, as a payment to give over the other part of the land to his brother. And therefore, what's the nafkamina? What is the impact of ein brera? Machzirin zevozeh biyovel. Basically, when it comes to Yovel, we're going to have to go back to the original state. So imagine, if we're going to say that whenever there are two brothers to inherit their father, then there's going to be Chazar B'Yovel, and that's based on the principle of Kinyan Peros, Lav Kinyan Aguftami, and therefore each one is now acquiring ownership on the karka like a lokeach, and therefore it's Choser B'Yovel. If that be the case, we'll never have a situation of bikurim with kriya ella chad bar chad, unless there's only one son, a ben Yochid. Ad Yoshua ben Nun. In other words, you're going to have Reuven has a son Chanoch, and Chanoch has a son and a son. Each one for all the generations from Yoshua ben Nun has one son only. And then there's halach of Mevi Bikur V'Koreh. But if there's more than one son, and then the Lekuchos Dami, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and Kinyan Peres Lav Kinyan Aguf Dami, then how can you recite the Parsha as Adama Shanasatoli? Brilliant, come on. Omar Rava Kra Umasnisa Misayel Leila Reish Lakish. I'm going to bring you a pasuk and a brisa to support Reish Lakish that Kinyan Peres Lav Kinyan Aguf Dami. And we're going to start with Kra here at the end of our fourth perek.